The warehouse loading dock smelled like cold grease and rain when Olivia Munro's black SUV pulled up outside the chain-link fence, and Jake Donovan didn't even look up from the pallet jack he was steering, because billionaires didn't usually park next to dumpsters. Her assistant stepped out first, umbrella already open, and then Olivia herself emerged in a charcoal coat that cost more than Jake made in 3 months, her heels clicking against wet asphalt like a countdown. She was here because a courier had delivered the wrong package to the wrong man. Jake's business plan, the one he'd mailed out 11 months ago, and given up on ever hearing back about, had somehow crossed her desk again, flagged by an assistant who thought the sketches looked interesting. She hadn't come to invest. She'd come to see the man behind the drawings and decide, in person, whether he was a fraud. Jake set down the pallet jack, wiped his hands on a rag that used to be a t-shirt, and walked toward her without hurrying, because hurrying was something he'd stopped doing the year his wife died. Olivia held up the folder of his old designs, battery cell diagrams, frame geometries, motor torque curves, and asked him flatly whether he'd stolen them from someone smarter. Jake said no, just that, no defense, no story, no plea. That single flat no, offered without anger, was somehow more insulting to her than a lie would have been because it meant he wasn't afraid of her. So she reached into her coat, pulled out a business card, and set it on top of a stack of pallets, and beside it she placed a slip of paper with an address, a scrapyard 3 miles east, and told him that 5 broken-down motorcycles were sitting there with his name on them, hers to give and his to keep, worth about as much as his ideas were. Somewhere behind Jake, a warehouse radio kept playing static-laced country music, indifferent to the moment. Olivia turned to leave, heels clicking again, and just before she reached the SUV she looked back once, expecting him to call after her, to beg, to explain himself. He didn't. He just picked up the card, read it, and put it in his shirt pocket like it was nothing. To find out how a man humiliated with 5 broken motorcycles built an empire worth over $300 million. And what happened when the woman who mocked him came back years later expecting revenge, stay until the very end. 3 years earlier, none of this existed. Jake Donovan had been the lead propulsion engineer at Halbrook Motorworks, a mid-sized manufacturer outside Columbus that built commuter motorcycles nobody remembered the names of, and he had been, by every account that mattered, the best engineer the company had ever employed. He'd designed a regenerative braking system that cut battery drain by 18%. He'd filed 4 patents under the company's name, and he'd been 2 years into developing what he privately called Project Ember, an electric drivetrain meant to make Halbrook's bikes competitive with anything coming out of the coasts. He worked late most nights, not because anyone made him, but because his wife Claire used to bring him coffee in the shop at 9 o'clock and sit on an overturned crate reading paperback mysteries while he tightened bolts, and there was something about her presence that made the work feel like it mattered beyond the paycheck. Emma was 6 then, already asking sharp questions about why motorcycles didn't just run on the same batteries as her toys, and Jake would crouch down at her level and try to explain amp hours in a way a 6-year-old could hold on to. And she usually understood faster than half his coworkers. Then Claire got sick. It moved fast, the way the worst things do. An aggressive cancer that gave them 4 months from diagnosis to funeral. And during those 4 months, Jake missed deadlines he'd never missed before, walked out of meetings without explanation, and stopped bringing his usual precision to work that used to define him. Nobody at Halbrook knew why. He never told them, because telling them felt like it would make it real in a new way, and because some stubborn part of him believed that grief was something you were supposed to carry alone so it didn't become someone else's burden, especially not Emma's. He held himself together in front of her every single night, made her dinner, checked her homework, tucked her in, and then sat in the garage until 2 in the morning staring at half-finished blueprints he couldn't make himself touch. The company's president at the time, a cautious man named Franklin Voss, gave Jake exactly 1 warning, delivered through human resources rather than face-to-face, about his declining performance. And Jake nodded and said he understood and offered no excuse, because the only excuse he had felt too enormous to hand to strangers in a conference room. Meanwhile, a rising project manager named Dale Whitfield, polished, quick with a handshake, always first to volunteer for visibility projects, had been circling Project Ember for months. quietly documenting Jake's missed deadlines and emails that made no mention of the funeral Jake had attended on a Tuesday and been back at his desk for by Thursday. Dale wasn't malicious in any way anyone could point to. He simply positioned himself as the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who could carry the project across the finish line, while Jake was going through something. By the time Emma turned 7, Jake had been quietly reassigned off Project Ember, his name slowly edited out of internal documentation, his patents recorded under a joint filing that somehow listed Dale first. Jake noticed. He said nothing, because fighting it meant hiring a lawyer he couldn't afford, and spending money he needed for Emma's future on a battle that would only pull him further from her, and because some nights he genuinely wondered if he deserved to lose it all, if his grief had actually made him as unreliable as they said. He told himself the company's success didn't matter as much as being present for his daughter, and he half believed it. Halbrook Motor Works launched an electric commuter line 18 months later, branded entirely around Dale's name, generating $4 million in first-year revenue. Built on architecture Jake had drafted on nights, Claire sat reading on that overturned crate. Jake watched the launch event live stream once, from his phone, sitting in Emma's dark bedroom after she'd fallen asleep, and then he closed the laptop and never mentioned it again. By the time Olivia Munro's SUV pulled up outside the warehouse dock 3 years later, Jake Donovan had become someone the industry had entirely forgotten. A 41-year-old man who fixed forklifts and pallet jacks for $18 an hour, who packed Emma's lunch every morning at 6:15, and who kept a single-lock toolbox in his garage that nobody but him had opened in years. Olivia Munro, meanwhile, was 38 and running Munro Capital Partners, a firm she'd built from nothing after clawing her way up through venture rounds that men twice her age had tried to keep her out of. And she had exactly one rule she never broke: never fund an idea she couldn't verify. Jake's unsolicited business plan, hand-drawn schematics for a modular electric drivetrain, mailed to 40 different investment firms with no resume attached, no company letterhead, nothing but numbers that seemed almost too clean, had been rejected by every other desk it landed on. When it crossed hers a second time by administrative accident, she nearly threw it away too. Instead, on a whim she'd later be unable to fully explain, she decided to drive out and look the man in the eye herself. That decision, small and almost careless, would end up rewriting both of their lives, though on the drive out to that warehouse, dismissing another false promise, humiliating another fraud who'd wasted her morning, was the only outcome Olivia Munro expected. 8 months would pass before the first videos of Jake's garage started spreading online, and neither Jake nor Olivia had any idea yet how completely their paths would cross again. The morning after Olivia Munro left her card and her insult on that pallet stack, Jake drove out to the scrapyard address before his shift, mostly because Emma had asked him to, tugging his sleeve at breakfast and saying that if a rich lady left him motorcycles, even broken ones, they should at least go look. The scrapyard owner, an older man named Curtis, who ran the place with a dog named Bolt asleep by the gate, pointed him toward a corner lot where 5 motorcycles sat under a torn tarp, frames bent, tanks dented, wiring chewed through by rodents, one of them missing its front wheel entirely. Curtis told him Olivia's assistant had called ahead, paid in full, and left instructions that Jake could take them or leave them. Made no difference to anyone. Jake stood there a long time in the cold, looking at 5 machines that most people would call scrap metal, and something in him that had been quiet for 3 years shifted slightly. The way a bone that's been set wrong sometimes has to be broken again before it can heal straight. He didn't say anything to anyone at the warehouse about the bikes. He hauled them home 2 at a time in a borrowed trailer over the course of a week, and he lined them up in his garage against the wall where his old locked toolbox sat. And for a while he just looked at them without touching them, the way you might look at a door you haven't opened in years. Emma was the one who broke the silence, climbing up on a stool one evening while Jake stood staring at the wreckage, and asking him what the wires with the different colors did, pointing at the tangled harness on the nearest frame. Jake found himself explaining, slowly at first, and then with more of his old fluency than he'd used in 3 years, telling her about positive and negative leads, and what happened when current found the wrong path, and Emma listened with the same total focus she'd had at 6 years old, asking about batteries. And something in Jake's chest loosened, just enough to let him pick up a wrench. Meanwhile, at Halbrook Motorworks, Dale Whitfield had been promoted twice more since Jake's quiet departure, now sitting as vice president of product. His office, decorated with framed magazine features crediting him as the engineer who electrified an American icon. The truth was that without Jake's underlying architecture, Dale's team had struggled for 2 years to iterate meaningfully past the original platform. Patching software issues without ever touching the deeper design flaws Jake alone had understood, though nobody outside a small circle of increasingly frustrated junior engineers knew that. One of those engineers, a quiet young woman named Priya Anand, who'd joined the team 8 months after Jake left, had spent countless nights combing through old file directories, trying to understand why certain thermal management decisions had been made, and had stumbled more than once across draft documents with Jake Donovan's initials in the metadata, buried under Dale's name in the final published versions. She never said anything, not because she didn't care, but because she was 26 years old, 2 years into her first real engineering job, with student loans that made the idea of confronting a vice president feel like professional suicide. She filed the discomfort away the way people do, telling herself it wasn't her fight, and went back to her desk. Jake, for his part, had no interest in fighting anyone. Every evening after his shift, he came home, made Emma dinner, helped with homework, and then the two of them went out to the garage together. And what started as an hour here and there became something closer to ritual. He stripped the first bike down to its bare frame over 6 weeks, sandblasting rust by hand in the cold because he couldn't afford a proper booth, and Emma, now 9, kept a spiral notebook where she logged every part he removed in handwriting that slanted more neatly than most adults. She started calling it the notebook of everything, and Jake let her, because watching her fill its pages with torque specs and wire gauge numbers felt like watching something in both of them come back from a long distance. He designed the new drivetrain not from any surviving Halbrook files, since he'd never taken a single document with him when he left, but entirely from memory, redrawing the architecture on graph paper at the kitchen table after Emma went to bed, correcting old inefficiencies he'd never been allowed to fix the first time around, because Dale's team had prioritized speed to market over doing it right. Money was the real obstacle. Battery cells alone for a single prototype ran close to $1,100, and Jake was making just over $3,000 a month after taxes, most of it already accounted for by rent, Emma's school expenses, and the modest life insurance debt still trailing behind Claire's medical bills. He picked up weekend shifts loading freight, sold his motorcycle tool collection down to the essentials, and once quietly sold Claire's wedding ring, an act he never told Emma about and carried like a stone in his chest for months afterward, though he told himself it was what Claire herself would have wanted, that the ring was never going to build anything and the bikes might. By the 4th month, the first motorcycle stood nearly complete in the garage, its resurrected frame now wrapped around a compact electric motor Jake had modified from an industrial surplus unit, its range nearly double what commercial electric motorcycles twice its price were achieving, though at that point not a single person outside his own garage had any idea it existed. It was Emma, in the end, who changed that. She'd started filming short clips on Jake's old phone, mostly for her notebook, documenting each stage of the rebuild the way she might document a science fair project, and one evening, without asking permission first, she stitched together a 2-minute video of the first bike's transformation, rust to bare metal to gleaming reassembled machine, and uploaded it to a video platform under an account she'd made herself, titling it simply, "My Dad Fixes Broken Motorcycles." She showed him only after it had already been posted, half expecting him to be angry, but Jake just sat there scrolling through the 11 comments it had gathered overnight, most of them from strangers asking what the specs were, and something unfamiliar moved through him. Not pride exactly, not yet, but the faint uncomfortable sensation of being seen again after 3 years of choosing invisibility. He didn't know yet that Priya Anand, 3 states away, scrolling through her phone on a lunch break, would be the one to stumble across that exact video 2 weeks later and freeze mid-bite, recognizing something in the drivetrain silhouette that she'd only ever seen buried in old file metadata under initials nobody at Halbrook ever spoke aloud anymore. 2 months would pass before that recognition turned into anything more than a private, startled suspicion she didn't yet know what to do with. Priya watched the video 11 times before she said anything to anyone, pausing frame by frame on the motor housing, comparing its proportions against sketches she'd memorized from those old buried files. And by the third night of doing this in secret on her apartment couch, she was certain enough to feel sick about it. She didn't reach out to Jake directly, not yet, too uncertain of her own red and too aware of what she stood to lose if she was wrong. Or worse, if she was right and it mattered to the wrong people. Instead, she began quietly gathering what she could. Screenshots of file metadata, timestamps that predated Dale's earliest documented contributions by over a year, an old internal presentation deck that had somehow survived a server migration with Jake Donovan's name still on the title slide before someone had clearly gone back and swapped it. She built a folder on a personal drive, unconnected to any company account, and told no one, because she had learned enough in her time at Halbrook to know that evidence without power behind it tended to simply disappear. Olivia Monroe, unaware any of this was happening 3 states away, found herself thinking about the maintenance mechanic from the warehouse far more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't guilt exactly, not at first. She told herself she'd simply made a shrewd, if theatrical, decision, testing a man's character by handing him garbage and seeing what he did with it, a technique she'd used before with founders she suspected of overselling themselves. But 3 months after that day, a colleague at an industry mixer mentioned offhand that a video of some backyard mechanic building electric motorcycles from junk was circulating in engineering circles, gaining traction for drivetrain efficiency numbers that seemed almost implausible for a garage operation, and Olivia felt something cold drop through her stomach before she'd even consciously connected the dots. She went home that night and watched every video on the account herself, all 4 of them by then, and recognized the frame geometry from the folder of hand-drawn plans she still, for reasons she hadn't examined too closely, kept in her office rather than her shredder pile. She didn't call him. Calling him felt like it would require an explanation she wasn't ready to give. Instead, she had her assistant quietly pull whatever public information existed on Jake Donovan. And what came back? A mechanic's job, a 9-year-old daughter, a wife who'd died 3 years prior, a prior employment history at Halbrook Motor Works that ended around the same time a company vice president's career had suspiciously accelerated, assembled itself into a shape she didn't like at all. She sat with that folder open on her desk until nearly midnight, replaying the moment she'd set his own drawings down on a pallet stack and told him they were worth about as much as his ideas. And for the first time in a long while, Olivia Monroe felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel in business. The distinct, unpleasant sensation of having been cruel to someone who hadn't deserved it. She drove out to the warehouse a second time, alone this time, no assistant, no umbrella, just her own car in the rain. Jake was on shift, and when he saw her walk onto the floor, he set down his tools slowly, the same unhurried motion as before, though this time, there was something guarded behind his eyes that hadn't been there the first visit. Olivia didn't apologize outright. She wasn't yet capable of that kind of directness, not with a stranger, not about something this raw. But she told him she'd seen the videos, that the drivetrain efficiency numbers were extraordinary if real, and that she wanted to fund a proper prototype lab, full resources, no strings, starting immediately. Jake listened to the entire offer without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, simply, that he appreciated it, but that he needed to think about it, because the last time he'd trusted someone with what he built, his name had been erased from it entirely, and he wasn't in a hurry to hand over something that mattered to him and Emma to a stranger a second time. However wealthy or well-intentioned she was, he didn't say Halbrook's name, he didn't say Dale's name. He said only that much, and it was enough to make Olivia's stomach tighten with the sense that there was a much larger story sitting just beneath the surface of this quiet, unhurried man. Before she could press further, her phone buzzed with a call she couldn't ignore. One of Monroe Capital's largest portfolio companies, an aerospace parts manufacturer she'd personally championed to her board, was collapsing under a supplier fraud scandal that threatened to wipe out nearly $60 million in invested capital, and threatened, more immediately, to become the very public failure her board had been waiting for an excuse to use against her. The crisis consumed the next 6 weeks of her life almost entirely, forcing her to shelve the Jake Donovan question even as it continued gnawing at the back of her mind at 3 in the morning. It was during this same 6-week stretch that Priya Anand, watching from a distance as Halbrook's stock quietly slid on disappointing quarterly numbers that Dale's team couldn't explain, finally worked up the nerve to do something with the folder she'd built. She didn't go to Dale, she didn't go to HR. She found an old company directory, looked up a number that hadn't been disconnected, and left Jake Donovan a voicemail that she re-recorded 4 times before she was brave enough to send it, telling him, in a shaking voice, that she thought she had proof of what had really happened to Project Ember, and that she'd understand completely if he never wanted to hear from anyone at Halbrook again, but that she couldn't sit on it anymore. Jake listened to that voicemail standing in his garage at 11 at night, Emma long asleep, the 5 motorcycles behind him in various states of rebirth, and for the first time in 3 years, he sat down on the cold concrete floor and let himself cry. 6 weeks later, once Olivia Munro finally resurfaced from the aerospace crisis, with her firm's reputation bruised but intact, she would return to Jake's warehouse for a 3rd time. And this visit would break open everything both of them had spent years trying to keep buried. By the time Olivia returned to the warehouse that 3rd time, Jake had already spoken twice with Priya Anand, first by phone, then in person when she flew out on her own dime to hand him a physical drive containing everything she'd gathered. The timestamps, the buried metadata, the original presentation deck with his name still ghosted beneath a hasty edit, and a written statement she was willing to put her own signature on, career consequences or not. Jake hadn't decided yet what he wanted to do with any of it. He wasn't interested in lawsuits or public takedowns. 3 years of grief had reordered his priorities in a way that made corporate vindication feel almost beside the point, next to Emma's science fair projects and her growing fluency with a soldering iron. But he kept the drive in his locked toolbox anyway, next to Claire's old wedding photo, because some part of him understood that truth, once it existed in a physical, provable form, changed the shape of what was possible. When Olivia arrived that 3rd time, she found the garage door open, all 5 motorcycles now standing upright in various stages of completion, 3 of them fully operational, their custom drivetrains humming with a quiet efficiency she recognized instantly from the specification sheets she'd been obsessively studying for weeks. Jake was mid-repair on the 4th bike, Emma beside him holding a socket wrench steady, while he explained torque specifications in a tone so patient and exact that Olivia found herself standing in the doorway a full minute before either of them noticed her. She watched Jake demonstrate the regenerative braking system he'd built into the 4th motorcycle, almost identical in principle, though noticeably refined, to the system Halbrook had once marketed as Dale Whitfield's signature innovation, and watched him explain to his daughter, without a trace of bitterness, why the earlier version of this exact design had cut battery drain by 18%, a number Olivia had seen quoted verbatim in a 3-year-old Halbrook press release she'd pulled up during her research. She asked him directly, finally, in front of Emma, whether he'd built the original system too. Jake glanced at his daughter, who was watching him with the same open, unguarded attention she always had, and for the first time he answered a question about his old work, without deflecting it. He said yes. He told Olivia, in the same flat, unhurried voice he'd used the very first day they met, that he'd designed Project Ember from the ground up over 2 years at Halbrook Motorworks, that he'd filed 4 patents under the company's name because that was standard practice, that his performance had declined after his wife's death, and the company had used that decline to justify quietly reassigning him and folding his work into someone else's name, and that he'd never fought it, because fighting it felt smaller than raising his daughter well. He told her about Priya's voicemail, about the drive now sitting in his locked toolbox, and Olivia stood there in the doorway of a converted 1-car garage, absorbing the fact that the man she'd humiliated with 5 broken motorcycles had been, quite possibly, one of the most significant undiscovered engineers in the American motorcycle industry, deliberately erased by a company too small and too cowardly to admit what it had done. What happened over the following weeks unraveled with a speed that surprised even Olivia, who was no stranger to corporate collapses. She didn't threaten Halbrook or leak anything to the press herself. Instead, with Jake's reluctant permission, she quietly acquired a controlling stake in a struggling parts supplier that Halbrook depended on for battery casings, and used that leverage, along with the documentation Priya had gathered, to request, through entirely legal and procedurally boring channels, a formal audit of Halbrook's patent filings from the period in question. Franklin Voss, still nominally president though increasingly sidelined by his own board, ordered an internal review the moment outside auditors got involved, terrified of a public scandal, landing on a company already limping through disappointing earnings. Dale Whitfield, informed of the audit by a visibly shaken Priya who could no longer stomach staying silent, made the fatal mistake of trying to alter a decade-old file server's metadata himself late one night, an act that IT security flagged automatically within hours, and that made an already damning paper trail catastrophically worse. Within 3 weeks, Dale had resigned to pursue other opportunities, a phrase everyone in the building understood as a euphemism, and Halbrook's board, desperate to contain the fallout before it reached local business press, reached out to Jake Donovan directly for the first time in over 3 years, offering him an undisclosed settlement and a formal, if quiet, acknowledgement of his original patents. Jake didn't ask for money beyond what the patents were legitimately worth, and he didn't ask for his old job back. What he asked for instead, in a short, unemotional email that Franklin Voss reportedly read 3 times before responding to, was that Halbrook publicly correct the patent record to reflect his name as sole original inventor, and that the company establish a policy requiring any engineer on medical or bereavement leave to have their project credit protected during their absence, so that what happened to him could never quietly happen to anyone else at that company again. Meanwhile, Olivia had already begun a far larger project of her own, one she hadn't fully admitted to Jake yet. A full investment proposal for a new company, built entirely around the 5 garage-built motorcycles and the drivetrain architecture behind them, structured so that Jake retained majority ownership and full naming rights, with Monroe Capital providing manufacturing infrastructure, supply chain access, and enough capital to move from prototype to production line within 18 months. She presented the proposal to Jake on a Sunday afternoon, sitting on an overturned crate in his garage in a blazer entirely wrong for the setting, while Emma sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, pretending not to listen to every word. Jake read through the term sheet twice, slowly, the way he read everything, and then looked up at Olivia and asked her quietly why she was doing this, whether it was guilt or good business. She told him, more honestly than she'd told anyone in years, that it had started as guilt and become something closer to certainty that she was looking at the best engineer she'd ever met, and that those two things no longer felt separate to her. 11 months would pass before the company they built together, which Jake insisted on naming Ember Motors, would deliver its first production motorcycle, and neither of them yet knew that the day of that launch would become the exact scene the world would eventually watch play out on stage, in front of every camera in the industry. The launch event for Ember Motors' first production motorcycle took place in a converted airplane hangar outside Columbus. 11 months to the day after Olivia had sat on that overturned crate, reading a term sheet aloud to a 9-year-old who kept correcting her pronunciation of torque, and by then the company had grown from Jake's 1-car garage to a 140-person operation, with a waiting list of pre-orders that had crashed its own website twice. Reporters from 3 major outlets stood alongside investors and engineers, and near the front row, in a seat Jake had specifically requested for her, sat Priya Anand, who'd left Halbrook entirely 6 months earlier to join Ember Motors as head of propulsion systems, her old buried metadata finally attached to a name that mattered publicly instead of privately. Emma, now 10, stood beside her father on stage in a blazer she'd picked out herself, holding the actual spiral notebook. The original notebook of everything, its cover worn soft from use, because Jake had insisted that whatever story got told that day include the person who'd filmed the very first video. It was there, in front of that full room, cameras rolling, that Olivia Monroe stood up unprompted from her seat in the audience and walked to the small stage riser, And instead of delivering the polished investor remarks everyone expected, she told the room, without flinching, exactly what she'd done 3 years earlier. That she'd mistaken a grieving, brilliant engineer for a fraud, that she'd handed him 5 broken motorcycles as an insult meant to humiliate him out of her office, and that everything standing behind her on that stage existed because he'd refused to let her cruelty be the last word on his ability. She turned to Jake directly and said, in front of every camera and every reporter, that the credit for Ember Motors' existence belonged entirely to him, that her only contribution had been capital, and, eventually, an apology 3 years too late. It was public justice delivered not by a courtroom or a headline exposing Dale Whitfield's theft, though that story had already broken quietly in trade press weeks earlier, but by the person who had once wronged him, choosing, at real cost to her own carefully built reputation for ruthless shrewdness, to say so out loud. Jake didn't gloat. He didn't even look particularly moved in front of the cameras, though those who knew him could see it in the way his jaw tightened briefly before he spoke. He thanked Olivia, genuinely, for the 5 motorcycles, telling the room that her insult, however unintentional in its outcome, had cracked something open in him that grief alone hadn't been able to touch, had given him something physical to rebuild when he didn't yet believe he had anything left to give. He didn't mention Halbrook's settlement offer, still sitting unopened on principle in a drawer at home, because when the board had offered him a senior consulting title, along with the acknowledgement he'd asked for, he'd declined the title entirely, asking only that the credit protection policy he'd requested be written into their formal employee handbook, publicly, so that any future engineer going through what he went through would have their work protected without needing a viral video or a billionaire's guilty conscience to save them. The quiet coda came months later, on an ordinary Tuesday evening that nobody photographed and nobody live-streamed. Olivia had started coming by the garage. Jake still kept the original 1-car garage exactly as it was, unrenovated, the 5 original motorcycles preserved rather than sold, because Emma had asked him to keep them, and he couldn't imagine refusing her anything connected to that notebook. Olivia sat on the same overturned crate, no longer wearing blazers wrong for the setting, and watched Jake help Emma, now 11, wire a small custom electric go-kart she'd designed herself for a school engineering competition. And at one point, Emma looked up at both of them and asked, with the same total, unguarded directness she'd always had, whether Olivia was going to be around a lot now. Jake and Olivia exchanged a glance that carried 11 months of business meetings that had slowly stopped feeling like business. And Olivia told Emma simply that she hoped so, if that was all right with her. Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to torque specifications, then said it was fine, as long as Olivia kept bringing the good coffee, and went back to her wiring. Jake reached over and picked up one of the original 5 motorcycle frames, the very first one he'd stripped down to bare metal in the cold 3 years earlier, its paint still slightly imperfect where he'd learned as he went, and ran his hand along it the way you might touch something that had once been a wound and had become, instead, a kind of proof. If there is one thing this story asks you to carry with you, it's this. The world's full of people being quietly underestimated in loading docks and warehouses and cubicles nobody looks twice at, carrying skill and grief and worth that doesn't announce itself, waiting for someone to hand them either an insult or an opportunity, without realizing those can sometimes be the same thing in disguise. Jake Donovan was handed 5 broken, rusted-out motorcycles as a punishment meant to send him home smaller than he arrived. Instead, he built them, piece by piece, into proof of exactly who he'd been all along. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who never took the time to actually see you, let this be the reminder that being overlooked is not the same as being without worth. Sometimes it's simply the beginning nobody else was paying attention to yet. If this story meant something to you, stay close. Because there's one final truth about what Jake Donovan did with that first motorcycle frame that we haven't told you yet.